late 1920s to the early 30s is full of fashion innovation. The dropped waists started to come back to their natural waistlines, and the gowns that sat away from the body to allow for ample movement were now moving closer to the body and acting like a second skin. The dress made in this project is a 1930s bias-cut evening dress taken from Janet Arnold's Patterns of Fashion 2. My research that brought me to the UK in the first place was to get a degree in historical costume making. So when the time came to focus on one aspect of the first term and dive into it, I did not hesitate to pick the bias cut masterclass. My reason for choosing this class is twofold. Firstly, as a historical dressmaker, I do not use any polyester fabrics or synthetic fabrics. So that left out all the uses of stretch fabrics and elastics. But with cutting on the bias, you get the natural stretch of the weave as it acts in the same way as an elastane or lycra, more or less. The second part is that I wanted to remake this particular dress as it caused me some difficulties in the past. I wanted to redeem my lack of knowledge then and use my resources and knowledge now to make it better. The first place to look was museums on what types of fabrics were being used for these types of dresses and how they would have affected the body. From past experience at the museums, the bias cut dresses that I've seen were made out of silk, satin, or chiffon. And wouldn't you know it that the dress I chose was a bias chiffon dress with a satin bias slip underneath. I looked around on the internet and found that many others were made, but not just in satins or chiffons. This one in a diamond pattern that most resembles the silhouette to mine just so happens to be made out of satin. Another is this wedding ivory satin gown. Most that I found were all from the Met Museum in New York City. They were made from a stretch-woven silk to crepe fabrics, and other fabrics were used as well. The different types also meant that they could be made differently to fit over the body in a pleasing manner. And each one on the Met that was found in this video was from the early 1930s. The second place to go back to was the master class on bias cutting and draping. The class did teach me about draping with bias, which I had never done before, but it was much easier than I had anticipated. Whilst I did not use the same fabric in the class as when it came time to making the dress, the skills and techniques were in place to make it happen. I do have to say that I had wished I would have chosen something different, as I was only using my notes and knowledge from the bias masterclass and not any of the others, since they did not pertain to this work on the project. If I had chosen a dress or outfit that encompassed more of the classes that I had taken, that would have been more intuitive to the learning process, rather than just sticking to one class and shutting the others out. I still would have done a period dress, but it would have been one that could have taken techniques from the tailoring masterclass to get the correct shape in the jacket, or sewing skills of the tutu masterclass to use the gathering technique / hack to get even gathers, and even the use of the millinery class we took to make hat accessories or other millinery accessories to go with it. I do feel I missed out on that aspect of learning just so I could remake a dress that I had done before. But in the end, the dress turned out beautifully, and I am proud of the work that was done. After the first week of pattern cutting and researching to see if others had done this dress, I came up with several blogs that gave great tips on sewing with bias of different fabrics, one of which being satin, the fabric chosen that was for this gown. Another blog post that I found was a woman who had made this same dress but with slight alterations. Her photos and notes proved very helpful during this process. After research was done, it was time to sew the dress. The first thing to do was to make a toile. I did this out of calico just to get the rough shape of the original garment and figure out how much needed to be added to fit my body's measurements. After making the adjustments, I toiled it again out of some really cheap satin that I had bought for mock-ups of this dress, as it was closer to the weight and drape of the final satin I was planning on using. This turned out to be a great idea, as it's where I hit my first bump in the road. The pattern of the original was made in chiffon, and that in turn, I believe, made it more flexible when pulling and pressing on the bias seams. The satin, however, was not like this, and needed adjustments to tweak the pattern to make all the seams lie flat. Needless to say, it was an unremarkable task, and it was done to all the seams on the final garment. Looking back, I do wish I had just made the dress bigger in those areas, as it started to pull apart at those seams when going over the body, but that will be a problem to fix later on. The bodice was completed on schedule, and the skirt was next. This took longer than usual due to the fact that there are 10 layers of waterfall flounces on the front section of the skirt. I made all the pieces and learned a new way of hemming fabric, the picot edge. This was taught to me by looking up what the term was and then watching videos on how to do it. I made a few samples of them, but ultimately went up with the machine picot edge and just cut the seam allowance extremely close to the stitching. I did not have enough of the embroidered chiffon to get all the flounces done, so I used leftover satin that I had. This was a slight mistake though, because in the end I did end up having enough of the chiffon to do the whole front in it. The pattern did not specify that there is a lot of overhang on the flounces on each row, and I didn't realize this until I was halfway done. In the future, I will have to make sure that I take proper measurements and compare them to the pattern pieces, so it won't be a waste of fabric or time on my part. The skirt was finished along with the belt and the side placket, which was closed with snaps instead of a zip. This was due to the zip not lying flat, as the fabric was on a slight bias as it rounded over the body to the side seam. Snaps were the better way to go, and it lays nice and flat on the left side. Within the process of making this dress, it was clear to me that I was not learning to my fullest potential. I had a hard time relating what I learned in class to how I can use it in my practical work. But within doing the research again and looking back at what I did then, it is much easier to see where I messed up. For instance, figuring out how I should have gone about cutting my pattern. I only did flat patterning, straight from the book, and I only used the stand to see how the toile was coming along and how it was hanging and fitting to the form. I wish I had draped the entire dress on the form as it was to my measurements, and I could have used my creative cutting and draping masterclass knowledge to make a new pattern. I could have used Patterns of Fashion 2 as a base and built up from it, rather than just use it straight from the book and hoping it would just work out in the end. All I had done up to this point was flat patterning, and I have never really draped, especially on the bias. But I should have opened my mind to the possibility that draping was a better idea due to the bias being different in every type of fabric. Some have a more stretchy bias, others do not, and that's due to the weave and the material that it's made out of. All in all, however, I do believe that I made a pleasing dress to look at on the human form. I did use the bias masterclass knowledge given to me to make this, and researching was helpful to go about how to sew satin cut on the bias. If I had the opportunity to go back, however, I would re-drape the pattern and do it entirely on the stand. I also would have picked a different garment to make to tie in the other master classes that were taught to us, so as not to just do everything from one class and leave the others out. Thank you for listening, and have a happy time sewing. Thank you again. All the sources and the photos that I've used will be linked in the description below. A link of a PDF on my making process and journals will be in the description as well. Special thanks to the masterclass instructors of the first term, Sil DeVilli, Anna Maria Janissa, Lynn Hamilton, Liz Garland, Julia Walker, Madeline Vinay, Emma Brackenbury, and Emily Rose Spreadborough. Thank you, and have a wonderful day.